All right, everyone, perhaps we can get started. And welcome to the closing plenary of this, our first day of the Canadian Humanitarian Conference. I'm Sue Sabo from Canada's International Development Research Centre. Le CRD est heureux d'être l'un des co-organisateurs.
The IRDC is pleased to be one of the co-sponsors of this conference, as was the case in 2013. For those who don't know the IRDC, our role here in Canada is to help out with research in developing countries so that they can find more about their challenges and develop appropriate solutions in order to build up a fair and equitable society. Nigel mentioned this morning the importance of specific local concepts. Another role that we play in our mandate is to get the interveners together to open up dialogue between disciplines and to encourage linkage between research and policies and research and actual practice.
That I have the honor of introducing our two speakers on today's closing panel. The crises that they are going to speak about, Ebola and Syria, starkly illustrate what Minister Paradis referred to in this morning's opening plenary on the increased size and complexity of disasters. And their topics are also particularly relevant, given another reoccurring theme during today's discussions, the sobering reminder of the limit of external actors. So let me introduce our speakers. In fact, with Nigel's permission, I'm going to only speak briefly that he was introduced this morning. I will only say that he is the former regional UN humanitarian coordinator for the Syria crisis, which will be the context for his speaking about the Syria crisis this afternoon. Our other speaker this afternoon is Patricia Erb. The genesis of her commitment to helping children lay in her own work as a student, leader, and activist during the years of the military junta in Argentina. Patricia began working with Save the Children after earning her master's in international development planning at Cornell University, and she has held key positions within the organization for more than 20 years, including country and regional director positions, and now is president and CEO of Save the Children Canada. Patricia's efforts on children's and human rights have received international recognition from both government and civil society, and she has served as a board member for 27 non-governmental organizations, so clearly a very busy person. And Patricia is going to start us off this afternoon, and she's going to be speaking on the Ebola crisis. Thank you.
So, good afternoon. I say as you sit there after a full day of presentations, we're almost at the end. So, yes, I work with Save the Children. And Save the Children is also, I want to recognize, a member of the Humanitarian Coalition. And what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes, hopefully, is look at what one organization, Save the Children, is doing in its response to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Of course, because we are a child organization, you will see that focus on the impact on the children, but also maybe some of the challenges that an organization like ours has in a response of this type. Where do I press the button? Here. So we all know that the three countries that have been affected worst by the Ebola outbreak are Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea. And these countries were already countries that were considered the poorest and fragile countries categorized that way, having had armed conflict, war. And so the health system in these countries was already weak. There was gaps of infrastructure, medical equipment, staff, and so they were ill-prepared for an outbreak of this type. Nobody would be prepared, but those conditions made it worse. The magnitude of the outbreak weakened the whole system. Some of the results, or some of the numbers of this outbreak are about over 16,000 people that have been infected. And the World Health Organization says that over 7,000 have died. And we know that these numbers might be low. It's hard to keep statistics in cases like this. As of November 23, about 600 health workers have been infected, and about 340 have died, mostly local ones. This again reduces the possibility of response. And as organizations focused on children, we know that they suffer the most. And since the outbreak, we know that 4,000 children have lost one or more of their parents. You see in the picture two children, David, who's 7, and Mami, who's 4. They're from Liberia, and they have lost both their parents. What has happened? Their grandparents now are in charge of taking care of them. The mother used to be the one that did the main providing for the family. So now it's the grandparents who have to support themselves and their grandchildren. And their source of income is selling greens. Through the response, we have learned that David and Mami's story is replicated. While in quarantine, for example, we provided the family with survival kit that had rice, sardines, luncheon meat, mattress, soap, toothpaste, and buckets in which they put chlorine outside of the house. So children live through psychosocial distress of extreme loss. There's family separation, stigma, isolation, and the serious consequences of household food insecurity and livelihoods. And so there's havoc in the society. An organization like Save the Children was present, working in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea since 1990. And when it started, of course, we were doing some work in prevention and child protection. But it was until September that we launched a response to the Ebola outbreak that we call unprecedented in scale for an organization like us. And it had operational risks that we will talk about soon. It was in our DNA to do whatever it takes to treat those suffering from this terrible virus and to protect children, who are always the more vulnerable ones, and helping to control this disease. Our response in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea is, of course, a holistic one. So we have launched a direct response with surge that comes from outside, but we also are working with local governments and partners, like many other organizations here. And we deliver the traditional WASH programs, water, sanitation, and hygiene. We do work in education. in health, in child protection, that is related to this Ebola outbreak. One very important aspect of the response, of course, is communications, because it's a very important element to stop the outbreak. An example of what we would do related to communication is working with individuals, households, and communities to raise awareness of the disease, tackle dangerous behaviors to change them, and reduce the level of risk to the greatest extent possible through activities such as street awareness campaigns. We also carry activities as training teachers, health workers, nurses, and local organizations on prevention measures. We're broadcasting messages on the radio, printing posters and flyers, and informing people on how they can protect themselves against the virus and how they can stop the spread. Child protection is, of course, a central part of emergency response for an agency like Save the Children. In this case, in this response, we're providing interim care for children whose caregivers are receiving treatment in Ebola treatment units or who have passed away. We're also supporting children who have been orphaned already of Ebola, finding them foster parents and safe houses. An example in Sierra Leone is supporting the child welfare committees, such as the Child Foreign Network, to ensure that unaccompanied children in communities that have been heavily hit are not left behind. And we're also providing psychosocial support to help survivors to come to terms with the extreme loss. Education has been hit. After the outbreak, the schools have closed in both Liberia and Sierra Leone, and this has left 3.5 million children out of school. So to ensure that out-of-school children in the region have access to opportunities to learn during that time, we have worked closely with the Ministry of Education of Liberia to train teachers, training them also for the reopening of the school, which is taking place now, providing radio-based education lessons, and distributing school kits. We're now moving on to support the reopening of the schools of Guinea and Sierra Leone, but that's not scheduled yet. In the health response, of course, we have our traditional WASH programs that distribute kits of hygiene to the communities, also putting medical equipment in 62 medical facilities. But we did something that was first for Save the Children in its history. In this response, we built treatment centers and we're treating patients. So we entered into the medical response. This was probably possible because last year we merged with Merlin, who is an organization that puts healthline workers in emergency responses. But also because we received training from MSF and because we felt that it was time for us to move on this. But it wasn't an easy decision. Our large global agency spent over a month discussing, and there was many fears because we're not experts and because we were going to be doing mistakes and we were worried about those impacts. But in the end, we knew that this is what we had to do. So presently, what we have done is building Ebola treatment centers in Sierra Leone and Ebola treatment units in Liberia. These are centers where people come to be treated. In Liberia, we built 2, and we have not put medical personnel there, but we have used a partnership with the International Medical Corps to put people managing those centers. However, in Sierra Leone, we're managing the treatment center that was built with the UK government. It's the one where beside you will see the Canadian treatment center for foreign workers that get affected by Ebola. As we were learning, and we moved slowly, maybe more slowly than what we would like, the conditions also change. It started to need medical treatment closer to communities. And so again, we started to participate, because we work with partners, in some of the community health responses that are closer to communities and are smaller responses. And these are also very important, because the crisis has caused people not to use medical facilities anymore. And the impact of that, particularly for children, is important. There's no more immunizations happening. Children in these countries have diseases like malaria or pneumonia, and they have no treatment. They don't go because there's fear. And women don't go to have their babies to the centers. And so it's very important to get this functioning again. Okay. So it was difficult to learn that it's a 24-hour responsibility. There was the selection of staff, and we had overwhelming amount of people who volunteered and were qualified, but the whole process is something that it's hard to learn when you're doing a response of this type. Also, the stress on the staff as they're working and the time off they need to take, all those were high learning curves for Save the Children. So I'm just going to finish with some of maybe the challenges that we're left with. We know that these are still early days in the fight against Ebola. We also know that our response will need to merge the direct and quick with the long term. It has to happen immediately at both levels. We have to connect the dots to help to contain the spread of the virus and to support the reestablishment of local capacity in agriculture, livelihoods, health, and education. Prevention measures and protection measures for children are sometimes short-term, what we're doing right now, but they will be long-term. In health, we had done significant advances in reducing the gap for the MDG of maternal infant mortalities, and those are now widening. So there's a lot to be done. I just want to make a reference, because it has come up several times today, that in an organization like Save the Children, which does humanitarian response and development, there's a sense of false dichotomy in the choice of direct and local capacity. We know that to prevent risk, there's a formula right now that humanitarians use, and it says that risk is equal to the threat added to the vulnerability, and that gives you a measure of how much risk you have. But we know that if we make it into a fraction and we put as the denominator local capacity, the percentage of the threat and the vulnerability really goes down. So we have to work with the local capacity, because that's long-term. But we also have to, this response shows us clearly that we need the external intervention that is fast and quick and that has high technology. So Much will be required from humanitarian and development organizations like ours, as well as our partners, donors, and international governments, if this outbreak is to be contained. So we all need to step up.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Nigel, over to you.
Hello again. Can we have the lights? I'd like to see who's sleeping, please. I shan't be intimidated by the fact I'm one of the last things between you and the Earl of Sussex pub. So I shall only speak for about 40 minutes. I hope you'll bear with me. Okay. I hope you stay awake, and at this point, if you don't, it's too dark for anybody to notice. But I want to talk about the Syria conflict, but not all of its aspects. But I want to cover 4 issues out of the multitude of dimensions about the Syria crisis and conflict. So first, just a little bit about its origins and evolution, and a few lessons we might derive from looking at that. The second and third points are a return to 2 of this morning's themes, collaborating with and supporting local organizations, and the matter of protection failures. And the fourth is the issue of us being taking part in a comprehensive view of crisis, in this case, the Syrian crisis. And over the last year in the region, we worked on what we call the Comprehensive Regional Strategic Framework for the Syria Crisis, or the CRSF for short. We always have to have an acronym. So first, how did the crisis and conflict begin? I think most would say, well, it began with the Arab Spring and the protests of spring 2011. And of course, that was the critical flashpoint. But one of the key preconditions was the prior decade or decade and a half of drought, water shortages, and crop failures. And that led to a significant migration of the rural poor and agriculturalists to the cities, where they swelled the ranks of the impoverished in urban areas and living in abject poverty, growing discontent and desperation. And I think these helped to create one of the underlying conditions for the unrest, which initially was an urban phenomenon. So again, we don't often hear about this, but climate change, drought, crop failure, and the politics of water in the region, these all had an influence on how and when the conflict began. And frankly, I don't recall too much reflection on these factors. And I think an early analysis of the impact and potential destabilizing effect of these risks might have led to some risk mitigation planning. And I think it goes back to one of our points this morning. It does illustrate the value of preparedness, planning, and analysis, and of humanitarians, in the Syria case, talking to our agricultural development colleagues now. And if we can support food security or any kind of food production as part of our work, what should it be, and how should we proceed? So the protests in Syria started as a demand for more freedoms, democracy, jobs, economic opportunity, and there was no initial distinction between Shia, Alawite, Sunni, Christian, secular. Everyone protested together in their common cause. But as you know, the regime response to the protests was ruthless repression. And they targeted their repression very, very heavily. And they targeted against the majority Sunni population. And the fact that Shia Alawites were not getting hit was part of the conscious manipulation by an unscrupulous regime, which was instrumental in turning the uprising into a sectarian fight and dividing the protesters. And it was exacerbated too by external actors' intervention coming in on both sides, especially 2 years later in 2013, when Hezbollah intervened on one side and the formation of the Islamic Front started. And then this instrumentalization of the conflict was also helped by the fracturing of the opposition. And why was that? It was frankly because they had no experience of democratic pluralism, And again, this was after decades of ruthless crushing of any opposition by Assad, both father and son. But today, all of that history of protest and unity is forgotten, and we see the conflict totally characterized as a sectarian one. And the voices that we hear and that are given airtime are those of extremism and intolerance. But there may be an option here, there may be an alternative, and I would suggest that if humanitarians, human rights advocates, and those who understand Syria's tribal and community mosaic, its traditionally rich vein of tolerance that ran through Syrian committees, if we work together, we perhaps can still find a way of giving voice to the many moderate Syrians who do not want their country to go down a divided sectarian route. They exist, they're out there. The Carnegie Foundation has already done this with Arab writers and intellectuals, and others are doing it with Syrian tribal leaders who say this is not the kind of Syria we want. Perhaps this could start to lay the groundwork for a future tolerant, moderate Syria in the post-conflict years, whenever they are, perhaps decades from now. I think that's an AKF type of long-term thinking. But helping the voiceless to have a voice could provide a glimmer of hope for a future not riven by sectarianism, however remote that future seems at present. Okay, the second point, solidarity with local Syrian organizations. We talked about this in a broader context this morning, but another element of combining humanitarian response with resilience and planning for the future is this, the matter of support to and collaboration with Syrian organizations, whether they be diaspora or local from Syria itself. And both to deliver humanitarian assistance, perhaps, in their own communities, but equally important to keep community services operating under the most difficult conditions, maintaining water supply systems, sanitation systems, keeping hospitals, schools, and local flour mills open. Now, it's not possible everywhere, but it is possible in a lot more locations that are now being assisted by external actors. And let's face it, these organizations are going to be around in Syria a long time. We've gone, our money has run out, or we've moved on to another crisis. Now, INGOs have been working with and through local actors for several years and doing great work. But local actors still believe that they can do more and want to be able to access support directly themselves from donors. So, working out of Gaziantep in southern Turkey, near the Turkey-Syria border, OCHA has worked with an organization which was started in Canada called Building Markets, and we've been working to help Syrian organizations come together in an association, first of all, but also to start having a process where we can vet them and validate them as eligible for international grants. And part of this process is also to ascertain training and capacity building requirements. And often it's not just technical, but it's organizational management, it's financial management, it's technical or logistic support, how to fill in grant application forms, how to prepare donor reports, training on IHL and humanitarian principles. And OCHA, as perhaps some of you know, has also created now a cross-border emergency reserve fund to give priority to supporting more Syrian organizations. And OCHA is also going to try and assume some of the risk inherent in working with local organizations that don't have a long track record, and it's something that worries the donors. But having said all that about OCHA, let me go back and, again, not forget to recognize INGOs who have been doing creative work. Mercy Corps, for example, which has found very creative ways of getting large amounts of cash into the local economy also. And what I said this morning, that's a helping hand rather than a handout. Third point, briefly on protection issues. Again, this morning I raised the issue of large-scale protection failures in Syria, the impunity of the regime, its manipulation of the humanitarian community, the challenges of access and compromises made. And I think it's worth remembering that, at least for the UN, protection is a core part of its purpose and objective for being in a country in crisis. And obviously, humanitarian action is not just about delivery of material support and services, but it is very much about protection too. And as we agreed this morning, we do have to take a fresh look at how we operationalize humanitarian principles, access, sovereignty and consent, and protection of civilians. So I won't repeat this morning's discussion, save to say that we in the humanitarian community do have to thrash out how we continue to live by our principles in these highly complex and politicized environments. And I think then we should take that discussion and our recommendations to the wider world. I honestly don't think, I come from a UN background, what can I say? I don't think that it would be a waste of time to foresee an international conference in due course on international humanitarian principles, international humanitarian law, sovereignty, consent, for example, to expose the challenges we face and consider how we move forward in a very complex world. The world is very different from the last 20 years when we developed so many of those norms and standards. As I said this morning, I feel they're slipping away. Compliance is slipping. We need to come back to them and see what do we do in this environment. The fourth and final point, this one of developing a comprehensive perspective of crisis, and in this case, the Syria crisis. A few words on the whole issue of taking a comprehensive view, a coherent view of complex crises. And we heard again this morning that it's needed, but at the same time, it worries some who fear a dilution of humanitarian principles, focus, or capacity to act. Now, between September 2013 and May of this year, in the region, I led an effort to develop what we call the Comprehensive Regional Strategic Framework for the Syria Crisis. And to try and bring together people from different disciplines, walks of life, to understand and respond to the Syria crisis. And I hope this report, the CRSF, is somewhere up on the OCHA website. I'll try and ascertain that before the end of the meeting. And this initiative brought together all kinds of actors, refugee hosting governments, OECD and Arab Gulf donors, INGOs, national civil society and regional organizations, the Red Crescent, UN agencies, IFIs. And it tried to do what I again suggested as necessary this morning, which was to develop a regional analytical framework which examined the crisis from every angle. Humanitarian, refugee, the needs of affected communities, competition for housing, social services, jobs, the resilience dimension. How do we help communities to help themselves? Issues of threats to social cohesion and security issues. Financial and economic considerations and so on, institutional strengths and weaknesses, and for us, better targeting and effectiveness. And I think as humanitarians, we do need to be part of this kind of integrated process. Then countries neighboring Syria, after we developed this regional framework, then as well as the country team in Syria itself, then developed and are still developing their own specific articulations of the framework, and then as well as developing dashboards to assess progress. I have to say, I think it was a huge achievement, but at the same time, a very stressful one, one that has met and continues to meet many resistances along the way, concerns about protection of mandate, sources of finance, and so on. And an unfinished part of the agenda is to develop and update scenarios for the ongoing evolution of the crisis to help us determine our future responses and further afield imagine what post-recovery Syria might look like. It's going to have deep sectarian tensions initially, which we have to address. Infrastructure is going to be destroyed. Tens of thousands of qualified Syrian professionals won't be there anymore. Lost or fled the country, doctors, teachers, engineers, administrators. And we have to look at resilience and development in that context, and then back it up to us as humanitarians. What do we do now? Again, like supporting local organizations. Now, I've now left the UN, but I hope this initiative doesn't die. And it did convince me that when we as humanitarian actors, we have to engage with actors in other disciplines and domains, including those from the global south, to see how we share perspectives on crisis, on international standards and obligations, on both immediate and longer-term resource needs and responses, on how we divide our responsibilities and resources most effectively. So that's it. One, learning from the origins of the crisis. 2, working with local organizations, 3, protection issues, and 4, developing the comprehensive analytical and strategic framework. Obviously, it's the understatement of the year, perhaps the decade, to say that things are not getting better in Syria or Iraq. But I really don't think that we can give up hope. And we have to keep prodding and poking around for creative responses to protection and delivery of aid, innovative approaches, wider partnerships, and alternative paradigms. But I don't think we have any choice but to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel, and thank you, Patricia. I think you've reminded us that the humanitarian disasters that we speak about are often made up of many, and far too many, of these individual disasters at the family level, and also that they are made up of many complex, interrelated, and spreading over long periods of time, the historical nature of the factors that can come together to create these disasters. Nigel, taking advantage perhaps of the fact that you were on the morning panel as well as on the panel here, I found that we've gone into a great deal of depth talking about the specificities of 2 humanitarian disasters that are facing the world. But I've been puzzling about something since this morning's presentation. I'm going to put it out as a question. Because this morning we talked about the fragmentation, the challenge overall of the humanitarian system in general. And yet, the purpose of this conference is also, as the title suggests, to talk about innovation. And this morning we also started talking about the whole issues around innovations, partnerships, new technologies, and such. And, so I have the question that's been lingering with me all day then, is that, is there a danger that focusing on the innovations, the new stuff, as it were, could become just a Band-Aid to this larger question about the challenges of the very foundations of the humanitarian system? Could it actually divert our attention from these larger questions, which again, at the beginning of the day, were put out as being so critical? And I ask this partly, because we are looking also at the World Humanitarian Summit coming up next year, and also because we've just come out of a panel that I was involved in that was looking at what's the future research agenda? Where do we put our attention, and in particular to a Made in Canada research agenda? So let me perhaps open with that question for both of you.
Yeah, I don't think that innovation is hopping out of nowhere and is going to scatter what we're doing. I mean, it's part of a broader framework. There is a lot of innovation by organizations in this room. Mm-hmm. But I do feel if we don't look at different ways of doing business, we will become even more fragmented. And I would question our relevance in the future. Our environment is very different from the one of 20 or 30 years ago. And I feel so much of what we do is still based on that time. So innovation is also about adaptation to a changing environment. And innovation is not just about technological fixes. It's about how we work. It is about what we all do together or separately. Because having been a coordinator, and I admit to all the blemishes of coordination, but it is a fact that there are many organizations, it's a disparate crowd, many work together, but you have a whole plethora of organizations which don't. There is a tendency to leap onto bandwagons, which I think we should think about. If I go back to Haiti, shelter was the flavor of the day. And we had probably 20 or 30 organizations getting involved in the shelter game, many of whom had not been at all involved in building housing, shelters, and so on. We got some instant 4x8 plywood slums. Thank you very much. We got very poor building standards in a country where so many people died because of poor building standards. So I would question that. So, it's not to say that organizations where they sort of multiple mandate are not needed. They are. But do we need to jump onto bandwagons, or should we focus? I think Rosemary was saying to me this morning or last night, perhaps we need to get together in coalitions around common issues. Perhaps we are too many and our own costs are increasing at a time that our resources are decreasing. So to me, innovation is, yes, there are new ways of doing things. I think it's important to look at technology, social media, distance learning in a Syria of the future where its educational infrastructure will be destroyed. We need that kind of innovation. But it's not coming out of nowhere. It's fitting into a dynamic, how we act together institutionally. How do we see how the long term affects what we do now? Because what we do now will affect the long term. So I would say it's not a distraction. I don't think looking at things differently and questioning our paradigm will lead to fragmentation. But I certainly think if we don't look at these things, we will probably become more fragmented and perhaps more irrelevant. And one of the critical issues is, one of the innovations is there are many different partners out there, especially from the countries and regions in which we're working with. We have to work with them. Many of them are suspicious of us and our motivations. So how do we work differently? And how do we not necessarily take the primary seat, but a supportive seat? So I don't see it as an issue. I see it as a necessity.
Excellent. Patricia, do you want to come in on that?
I think innovations are a natural thing for human beings. It comes out of adapting. It's when it comes out of need, it's because something isn't working or you have to find a new twist. In the example of Ebola, I see the innovation or the adaptation that some of those communities who have health centers and health workers are trying to find. They were first thrown off, but now they're trying to bring responses. So we need to look at those and integrate it. So it's something that we see in life and in our responses constantly. And we take them on when we need them. We don't have to innovate all the time. There's things that we can continue to do. We've done them well and we know, but there's other things that we need to change because the world changes or there's new needs.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's open it up to questions from the floor. I think we need the lights dimmed so that we can see who's out there. Yes, perhaps it's a little bit difficult to actually see into the audience, but I don't know if it is possible to. There we go, changing the lights just a little bit. All of a sudden you've all appeared to us. That's great. Good. If we can just see from a show of hands, perhaps we'll take a few questions together if we have some questions in the audience. Or are we getting Yes, I think that might be the case. Khalil.
Khalil Sharif with AKFC. Thank you both for your presentations. You both talked about situations that where there were some signals in the lead up to the outbreak of a crisis that may have tipped us off. So my question for you is, where should we be looking next? Either on health issues or in areas where the kinds of fragilities that were building up, leading up to the outbreak of violence in Syria. What do we take from the experience so far about what we should be doing elsewhere now?
Well, maybe I could start, if I can go backwards in order to look forwards. Again, I think, take Rwanda, 1994, or early 90s. Take Darfur. We see again those both as tribal, sectarian acts of genocide. But what if we'd looked at Darfur as a situation where population growth has been so rapid that the land can no longer support that level of population? A basis for tension, competition for resources, desperation, enmity. Rwanda, again, same thing. Most densely populated country in Africa. All of its agricultural territory basically used up. Folks with nowhere to go, no job. Again, economic pressure. and a leadership that instead of saying, hey, we need to look at this together and see how we need to diversify economy, said, no, those folks are to blame, we need to get rid of them. So I think we need to look at these issues. Again, it gets back to these roots of conflict, whether it's climate change, whether it's pressure on agriculture, whether it's, as in Syria, the movement of a rural population to urban areas. What are the signals? So I would come back as a general statement to the parties is what are we as humanitarians going to suggest to those who are working in countries pre-crisis? And I think we say, we need your help, we need to work with you to look at this country and the kinds of situations in terms of governance, inequity, economic development or not, that could lead to crisis. And would we look at Darfur and Rwanda any differently? I don't know. How was it that Rwanda, in those immediate months and years prior to the outbreak of genocide, was the darling of the international community? Everybody was pouring in money. How come we didn't see this? So I would say we need to be looking for sources of potential stress. And they come from many angles. I think there are many out there that are doing these kinds of analyses. So the question is, how do we bring that analysis into our preparedness? I feel as humanitarians, we often think quite simplistically of preparedness. How can we develop shelters when floods happen? How can we get organizations to respond better? But some of these more difficult issues of poor governance, of underlying issues of community fracturing, etc., we don't get to. The issue, as I said this morning, of who's there that we can partner with so we know in advance. So it's not a very specific answer to your question, but I think it's just better analysis with a different range of partners and bringing in partners to solve bits of the equation that we can't. If local partners, let's say, imagine in an earthquake, they're going to lose their capital, their equipment, they need to be recapitalized, that's not our job. But IFIs, international financial institutions, can do that. They don't normally come into a crisis quite late after it's evolved. Can we change their policy? Can we, if we talk about this issue? So I'd say open up. We need to open our eyes to those sort of preparatory, preventive crisis conditions, and then say, okay, how do we work together to start to address those? Easily said. It's much more difficult to get resources for prevention and investment than it is for crisis. But in the end, we are a band-aid to keep people alive until political conflict issues get resolved. Some of those resources could be used earlier, perhaps, to help a country avoid the precipice.
Joshua, do you want to come in there?
I don't know what to add other than to say that I think there's a full spectrum, that there's many organizations like ours that do both development and humanitarian response, and there should be, it shouldn't be, we used to call ourselves a dual mandate organization, so we separated it, and our teams kind of thought differently. And we know there's some emergency responses we won't be able to avoid. But we know, for example, in the East Africa drought, and that it was the work that we were doing in development that held it, so it was 10 years of drought. And if we wouldn't be doing all that livelihoods work and all that prevention, and we knew we kept it getting to the very, very worst that it could have, and much sooner. So I think that connection is one thing that we should be doing better.
Yeah, just one point too. I think the relief to development continuum should have died about 20 years ago, but it still raises its ugly head. And I think one of the strongest arguments for us working with folks who are not in the humanitarian domain, in the development domain, financial domain, is crisis and the need to look already at development issues. It's simultaneous. And therefore, we must know how to work with folks who have a different perspective than us in terms of resilience, development, the IFIs, and so on. So to me, acknowledging that there is no relief to development continuum, but things happen simultaneously is a very strong argument for really looking at this comprehensive approach.
Mm-hmm. Just to mention, when you were talking about some of the roots of the conflict, it made me really think about the whole situation about youth unemployment, particularly in Africa, but elsewhere, which we've often described as the ticking time bomb, and certainly politicians are starting to think of it that way as well. It's not just an economics question, but very much a question about social cohesion and potentially about violence. We have a question over here.
Oui, je suis Pierre Micheletti.
I'm a teacher at the Political Institute in Grenoble. I firmly worked on the board against famine in France. We have two panelists who, in fact, represent two perspectives when it comes to crisis. And so there's epidemiological crises such as Ebola, and then the particular crisis in Syria. But I'd like to focus on Syria and point out that humanitarian organizations need to reflect on the history of countries that are affected by crises, whether this be a long-term reflection on what has happened, and also understand that these countries don't necessarily only have a westernized vision of the problem. Let's now turn to the Syrian problem. From my point of view, the root causes of this crisis go further back than recent history. And in fact, in part, go back to things that aren't politically correct to say. For example, the way that the borders were drawn after the wars in the 1920s goes back to how the powerful colonizers used religious and tribal fragmentation to contain local powers and to put power into the hands of others. So how should we, for example, consider the Afghan crisis in the context of how the borders separated the Pashtun people into two fragments, and the role of the secret services in many of the major powers, how religion has fueled the fervor of anti-communist thought. These are all things to reflect on. And I think one of the characteristics of humanitarian organizations, when they do rub shoulders with those parties in the conflict, need to remind themselves of the various perspectives in the field without, of course, taking a bias. I think we need to have a pluralistic interpretation of what is going on in these regions. Much further back, Sykes-Picot interference in the region from the West, from oil companies, etc., you name it. I will say one thing, having worked in Afghanistan and around the Syria crisis. You're right. I mean, these are false borders. They don't reflect long history. But I don't meet too many Syrians, especially on the moderate side, or don't meet too many Afghans who actually want to rewrite the borders. They say, we're Afghan. In Syria, I met a group of tribal leaders from the north who had parts of their tribe in Turkey and parts in Iraq. And they say, we're all one tribe, but we're Syrian. So there is not that sort of desire, it seemed to me, to rewrite the boundaries. But you're right. I mean, I go back a couple of years. You can go back 20, 30, 40, 50 years to look at those roots. And I do think it is an irony that we tend from the West, from Europe, etc., to be the strongest human rights advocates. And more than one person of a certain age has said to me, don't you find it strange that now you're coming here advocating your principles and human rights when just a generation ago or two you were exploiting us? It's an interesting change of perspective. So I think this issue, again, of solidarity, of partnership, rather than us trying to do all ourselves. It's really important. And while I think we have a role, it may be a different role. It may be a slightly more secondary role than it's been in the past to create space for national and local organizations to take their role. And as I said at the end of the day, a humanitarian presence is always short-lived. Short might be a year, it might be 20 years, but it's not forever. And it's organizations, it's Afghans, it's Syrians, whatever, who will be there in the long term. And I think it's our obligation, even in the midst of crisis, see how can we help these folks function so that they have a long-term future.
Good. Well, I think we're going to bring the day to a close. It has been a very busy day with lots of active engagement, I think, by all the participants, especially since we've moved in and out of plenaries in smaller groups. So first, if you can join me in thanking Nigel and Patricia for this excellent final panel. So now on to just a few housekeeping items, if I can, before we adjourn. So it's been a very full day. However, just a reminder that we're going to start again at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow. So that's going to be bright and early. As well, if you haven't yet, I've been asked to remind you that the World Humanitarian Summit survey is available. If you haven't filled it out yet, that is a key piece that we want to come back to tomorrow. And so at the back of the room, there is the ability to fill that out. Let me thank, because it's always good to end a day with thanking people, let me thank the Aga Khan Foundation Canada for their gracious hosting of us here in this amazing building of the Delegation of the Ismaili Imamat. It's a space that really helps us and inspires us to think beyond ourselves and for our ambitions for those who we serve. And so I think that has really contributed to the quality of the debate and the discussions today. And again, thanks to the volunteers, over 30, who have made this day pretty much flawless. So again, you were thanked at the beginning, but let's thank you again.